Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming here. Um, so I'm Daniel. I'm a founder of Ubicloud, and what we're trying to do is build an open source alternative to Amazon Web Services and Azure or GCP, so infrastructure cloud. Our focus is currently a managed service, which you can use today at ubicloud.com, and we focus on value, that's a cost effectiveness, and the quality of core services rather than a huge number of services. So, for example, virtual machines, load balancers, and databases per slide. And I really hope you can use it, and then especially help us improve it with your feedback and bug reports. Always my favorite uh, thing about customers is their bug reports. It's written in Ruby, which used to not be remarkable in 2011 when I started writing programs like this, but it's become remarkable these days. Ubicloud is the fourth in a series of programs I've written that are like this. Uh, I consider each time whether I should change the language, but so far I've always ruled out all the alternatives for, I think, strictly practical reasons. Originally, I joined Heroku Department of Data as a Postgres person, and it was a Sinatra application that used SQL. Um, so this is where I actually got into Ruby. I was a Postgres person. They had a few Postgres databases, and then we built it up from our tiny team of 3 into whatever you see today at Heroku Postgres. As a result, I never have used Rails, which already puts me in extremely narrow company in the Ruby community. Um, and I never really engaged with Ruby's cultural institutions, such as this conference or RailsConf or even the user group in San Francisco. But in 2024, Irina, who organized the San Francisco user group, heard that this startup called Ubicloud used Ruby to write control plane software, and she assumed Rails. And I said, oh yeah, well, we don't, first of all, yes, we are Ruby, but also not Rails. She said, okay, well, that's extremely weird, and then you're extremely weirder. So you should tell us about why you're so strange. And so here I am giving this talk. I'm going to focus on 2 areas. One is I want to talk about some core libraries or key libraries that we use. And actually, I want to discuss how they're developed, which I think is quite extraordinary. And then furthermore, I think that this is the news you can use part of the talk. You can use some of these libraries in your own work and hopefully benefit as I have. But then after kind of setting your mind in how I view these libraries and what's so extraordinary about them, I want to discuss the strengths of Ruby as I see them, which I think is different than most since I come from kind of both the inside, having done it for so long, and the outside. So first, what do all these things do? SQL, sometimes called, well, it's very easy to make it confused with SQL, does database access and ORM. That's probably the most well-known of these libraries. And Rhoda does HTTP routing. So it took the place of Sinatra in my stacks in the last 2 projects. And Rodoth does authentication, which took the place of Devise, which is very kind of Railsy. And with access to all 3 of these things, I was able to build a full stack application with libraries that actually maintain under a very similar regime. So main question is, what makes a library key? What makes a library key is it has a very wide interface to my programs. Like SQL queries are everywhere in a web application or many applications, not even just web. You have calls from everywhere. They're very invasive in how you write the program. You can't just swap them out. And same is true for the web framework as well. Like how you organize everything has a lot to do with how it works. They're necessarily invasive to your program. A counterexample, something that you want high quality but it's not invasive, is a database protocol driver. So this is why I focus so much on the key libraries, and they are a perfectly good reason to use any particular language. But why do we care so much, or I care so much about how they're developed? Do you just look at the spec sheet and say, oh yeah, it looks like it does what I want and it looks pretty good to use, so I'll just use it. This talk is actually not about how you use the stack, because it just couldn't possibly fit in the half hour while discussing what I want to discuss. But there are certain ways these libraries are developed that actually inspired me over the last 13 years when I first encountered them, that Ruby could be very different, I think, than most people think of it as. Normally, there wouldn't be much to say about, like, oh, gems release once in a while, there's a new version, blah, blah, blah. Well, this is the exception where it's extremely odd. So it's all about this guy who will be here tomorrow and speaking on Friday. You should see his talk. All three of these key libraries are maintained by Jeremy Evans, and they work together cohesively and don't drift apart for that reason. And SQL was his first well-known work, which we used at Heroku. We started using it in 2011. By 2012, we were so perplexed at how he maintained it that we invited him to give a talk just about what his process was. In particular, we were confused how he had, well, that's a spoiler. Okay. So there's if you go to this slide deck, I'll post a link later. You can go and click on these links, like the presentations. He has archives of his presentations, and you can find that one, take a look. And he's definitely one of the few software engineers like I've ever seen that kind of redefined what is possible to do, not only with Ruby, but just in general. But I think many of his practices have something to do with how Ruby works. So I've been trying to duplicate his efficiency for the last decade because I haven't quite replicated it yet, but I'm getting closer. It's only taken me 13 years. So because of this, I want to dwell on some of the outward signs of how this works. Okay, so first bizarre Jeremy Evans fact, or at least a few. If you kind of just blink in his talks or interviews, you'll miss something because he's kind of humble. But sometimes he gets cornered and will like let a fact leak that, if you think about it, is actually just insane. For example, this remark: "It gives me a sense of accomplishment to be able to fix bugs in Ruby that have been known but unfixed for many years. That's a situation that doesn't happen in my open source projects." And you might say, like, well, that can't literally be true. He must mean something kind of metaphorical. But no, it's actually literally true, where every single issue is always closed on all of his projects, not because he told you, go to hell and go away. He actually just fixes everything. Also, 1,200 issues over, 2007, 14 years, is not that many issues. And so whenever I say this, people say, well, maybe nobody's using it. And I said, no, it's the weird one. It's the case where there's actually not many bugs, and he closes them all. SQL is not a micro ORM. It has like every feature. It always seems to have new Postgres features while Postgres is in beta. So in beta, it'll be like, JSONB or upserts. It'll have new dataset methods to let you wrap in the DSL. Now, I mean, 0 issues, only 12 issues over 14 years, and 0 open issues at any given time. That's a level of quality I like to see in a key library. Another thing that's extremely bizarre is there's monthly releases of the gem. These are the most invasive dependencies in my program. There's like tons and tons and tons of call sites everywhere. How can you release it every month and not break everybody all the time? But actually, I do, and then it doesn't break. I've maybe had 3 regressions of minor sorts in the last 13 years, and most of them are backloaded. I haven't had one in a long time. I just upgrade every month. I look at the diffs sometimes, the way he does month to month, and they usually aren't that big. And I think, oh yeah, like in principle, I could have done it, but coulda, shoulda, woulda, didn't. And somehow his relentlessness just adds up and makes it work. I've just never seen anything comparable to this in any kind of release. I don't know. Do you know of a single gem other than one that he writes that does stuff like this? I've never seen it. Have you even seen like any Python library or Node library or Go? I mean, I've never seen anything like it. It's just the breadth and the stability for such a huge interface in your program is just unheard of. I do have a kind of a rhyming practice that we use for services for Ubicloud and all its predecessors. I think this is more common on Ruby people than most, but we deploy every single pull request right after it's merged. So whenever you see in our history, like, hey, we merged a thing into Ubicloud's GitHub repo, it's in production like with the next few seconds. And the reason we do this is, one, it works fine. You don't need to, we don't feel the need to bake things or whatnot. It allows the author to supervise the outcomes without interfering changes. And it helps if you have a good test suite to be able to do this. But it works great so that whenever there's abnormalities, the author knows it was them and they, figure out what to do or roll back. So we actually do, in some ways, more releases than even he does. But I think this is somewhat more normal. Probably a lot of you are used to merging pull requests and deploying a website, I think. I'm not sure if everyone batches their changes. Okay, so next weird thing. His projects are all based on a huge number of plugins. Because I kind of swapped in Rhoda for Sinatra, people think, oh, are these micro frameworks? And I would say they're definitely not Rails, but they're not micro. There's just a huge number of first-party plugins. This is like a really small screenshot of all the plugins, I think, in SQL on the left. So there's pages like that for all three. The plugins are many of them are first-party, also written by him, and you can almost think of them as lazy code loading. He's very particular about not loading code you don't need, and so actually everything is loads very fast, which is great for tests in particular. So you can even think of more of like configuration or lazy code than a plugin. I'm very impressed with their compact size and their scope. If you read the implementations, it takes a little while to understand the very short code, but there's not much to audit once you get it. For example, and they do things that are both trivial to fundamental. Streaming responses in HTTP, that's a plugin. You don't have to load it, but if you need streaming responses, you load it. Processing inbound email is a plugin. I mean, we don't do that yet, but if we did, I guess there's a plugin for that. It's kind of like there's an app for that. I just never seen so much cohesion delivered optionally, and it keeps apps that don't use all those features loading very quickly. That said, although the plugin is very broad, I kind of, interested in being practical, have some areas where they have no opinion, that you kind of do your own thing. One is no opinions on JavaScript. Now, one question is, do you need JavaScript? You know, our Cloud Console is an enterprise app. What do Cloud Consoles do? They show you tables. It's like, yo, bro, I heard you like tables. I put some tables in your tables so you can browse what you browse. It's kind of what cloud, it's just table after table, tables of VM, tables of load balancers. What do they really need to do there? So for us, actually, static pages, or dynamic, just dynamic server-side pages are fine, and they're easy to test, and you can generate screenshots easily, and you can do accessibility, and all sorts of stuff that gets really expensive with single-page apps. So that's one answer: is maybe don't use the JavaScript. But I know that in this world, you sometimes really do need some fancy interaction for JavaScript. And in that case, you basically have to decide how you're going to do it and how you're going to test it. In principle, I've heard there are robust ways to test JavaScript, but whenever I ask someone, can you show me a project that does it? Is there the sequel of Node? Or I just can't. No one seems to come up with anything. So therein lies the rub. Is there an RSpec of Node? Well, kind of, but can you do the partial mocks? Well, maybe. It's kind of a little bit hairy. Another area I think would be very interesting is it doesn't really have any opinions on mobile applications, which I see as a pretty nice thing that Rails has opinions about, is how to make turbo native. So that's kind of cool, and also not covered by the plugins. So to give you a sense, if you're building something where pure HTML apps, I have no hesitation about using this stack. If you need a lot of JavaScript, you kind of have to be ready to have opinions. So there's the proviso. But many of you, so this is kind of an obscure stack, and so many of you have prior commitments. And so I thought I'd talk about some useful plugins that might give you some of the benefits. There's Rodoth Rails and SQL Rails. Rodoth Rails, I think, is the most compelling because Rodoth is a very good authentication framework. As you can see here, it has a pretty big list of features, 2FA, recovery emails, magic links, all optional in plugins, by the way, audit logging, all this kind of stuff. Also a very strict security stance where it separates the password hashes, so you can't even, it's hard to implicate you in a credential stuffing attack. This plugin is well maintained, Rodoth Rails, and you could think of it instead of maybe using devise. That's a very practical news you can use. The other plugin is SQL Rails, which replaces the ORM with SQL. This is useful, I think, if you have an organization that has both ORMs, or if you really need some of the power, you have a lot of, would benefit from powerful database queries, because SQL is kind of known for having a very powerful data set model. It also is faster. Like the way the micro optimizations for allocation and so forth, and that actually really adds up in the tests. If you have a lot of tests, the speed of allocation and so forth really matters. Just doing .new, not even doing .insert, it does add up to speed up your test cycle. We actually used it in the second iteration of the system, and we had to fiddle with it sometimes, but it worked surprisingly well. So those are two pieces of news you can use. Here are some fun quotes about both of the kind of libraries. One is, I just pulled from the internet. Thank you, Futures Bright David. I always go for SQL. It's just a better design overall and 100% bug-free. Seriously, when did you last see an issue on the GitHub page that was more than a couple of days old? The other second comment was provided on Rodoth by one of the engineers that works at Ubicloud, but is working for Rodoth for the first time some months ago. And he says, as he submits the PR to add 2FA, we use the Rodoth library for authentication, which offers built-in first-party plugins for popular 2FA methods. Upon enabling these plugins, they function seamlessly without additional configuration. It was like a miracle. It just kind of worked, and it still continued working. Just because there's these really broad plugins doesn't mean that its frameworks are slow. Actually, they're incredibly fast by standards of Ruby programs. So if you look here, those little lines at the bottom are Sinatra and Rails, and up at the upper left, that big yellow line is Rhoda. And he's going to be talking a little bit about performance in his talk on Friday, so maybe you should go check it out. It's maybe the only piece of software over 10 years that gets faster. You can see at the lower right a commit he made to Ubicloud where he says, avoid 4 allocations for every request. So that stuff adds up, as it turns out. And he applies this kind of merciless optimization to his own libraries, which really matter, again, especially in your tests. He has 100% branch coverage on all of his libraries. This is a page, his open source page, and these are all the branch coverages. They're all 100%. When I first heard this in 2012, I was pretty shocked. That seemed like, the conventional wisdom was, after 80% it doesn't really matter. No. There's a difference between 95 and 100, and 100 is much better than 95. I've been doing this since I've adopted it to Ubicloud, so most of it is at 100% regime. And I've done it also at Citus and at Crunchy. And after, I guess almost 10 years, I've developed some insight into why it's a good idea. So here are some quick tips. One is you should do it. There's also news you can use. It's not really what about people think it is. It's true that with more tests, you tend to decrease some bug count, but really it helps you administer the introduction of gaps into your test suite much more effectively. Every time you see red, it's like, okay, I just did that because it was green before, and now those lines are red. Obviously, it's me. Furthermore, there's always a test that got to the adjacent line, so it's like, okay, I'll find a test that gets to that branch, and then I will put in a new test. It's always easy to add the next test. I think these are kind of the key things that make it work so well. So this is why I have advised, choose one file and make it 100% and enforce it. Don't worry about having area file 95. Try to get one file to 100. That way, the quickness of gap analysis is there for at least a part of your code base. So much better to have 100 on one than maybe 80 everywhere. It's kind of what I'm saying here. It's also, although it's kind of, you could say, developed or practiced by a solitary programmer, Jeremy is mostly solitary on his libraries, it works very well in teams. And the reason it works very well in teams is because when people are building their projects, there's kind of the promotion packet they got to build or whatever. And if someone didn't leave you a testing methodology, you're like, oh, do I really want to rip up all that code to figure out how to test it? And then they don't, and then the cracks get bigger and bigger. This kind of allows us to, okay, there's always a test, and to add a test, it's about even cost booked to your project. So I think this is also works very well in larger teams. Now you might be saying, okay, well, but you're an infrastructure cloud, so why are you talking about all this web stuff? Is that really necessary to, is this really the core of what you do? And I would say it sort of is. Definitely bookkeeping is a big part of doing infrastructure clouds. Just like, hey, list servers between the two create at dates, run this shell command, tell me what it says, collate it, and then build a report. So very strong ORM is key. That's why we kind of started with that at Heroku. Relational databases and powerful ORMs really help you with bookkeeping errors, and those cause a lot of outages. So that kind of makes that less likely. And a lot of security program problems are caused by excessive complexity in the web application or the API, and you need implementation polish and power to avoid incidental complexity to bloat your line counts and other things that make it hard to audit. And so my longtime collaborator, Will, who I mentioned on the slide, described our life's work in the previous 3 efforts as a fancy SSH client. And now the 4th is a fancy SSH client with a web page. Previously, the previous ones talked to an API to another system. So also special thanks to NetSSH for working so well for all these years. We kicked them a small sponsorship because apparently no one else does. And I felt bad because I've been using it for 10 years. So good library, NetSSH. So one of the main assets of Rails or Django is the prescription of how components fit together. You don't really get that from each library individually, but there's this handy, if not super slickly named project called Rhoda SQL Stack, where Jeremy is like, okay, here's how I suggest you glue things together. And that's what we based Ubicloud on. And then we added RODAUTH per the manual. And you should consider using this and looking at it. That's a link, by the way. Okay, so I wanted to move on. Just now that you kind of have a sense of what I'm impressed by and what I feel about kind of these libraries, I want to talk about reinterpreting what Ruby is good at. Because I think I see it very differently than most people, because frankly, I've been just sitting in a hole writing these kinds of control planes for 13 years and never going to conferences or writing in Rails apps, so I don't really see things the same way. Here's kind of a common list of interpretations I pulled from the net about what Ruby is kind of all about. Oh, it's inspired, artistic, beautiful, it's productive, there's developer happiness, but also kind of unprincipled or a little wild or hard to maintain or only good for prototypes. Personally, well, I've come to not see things this way. Here is how I see it. It's very stable. It's rigorous, prudent, restrained, and economical. So, I come from the database world, so I'm very much a killjoy. When you get right down to it, Postgres people, I mean, they're fun to hang around with, but mostly because of the gallows humor. It's for these reasons I use Ruby, not for kind of the more romantic reasons. Perhaps I'm very boring. And what else can you say about a software package that releases every month with 100% branch coverage? Is that not stable and rigorous? I mean, that's kind of how I feel about Ruby. Another thing is if you look at our line counts, Ubicloud supports all this stuff, but it's only 20,000 lines or so of application code, and then it's another 20,000 lines of test code. So we're getting a lot of economy out of what we do with the 100% branch coverage as well. That includes not every feature we want, but VMs, DNS load balancers, hosted Postgres, MinIO blob stores, a rich authorization system, web console, and then block device key management. So like all that's in there in 20K lock. I kind of use Ruby because it's so much more economical to build than if I were to, especially, static language would be very difficult. And then I would say that probably the other dynamic languages would be, I'd probably lose at least 30%, I think. Another thing is the language has gotten more stable over all these years. In 2013, it turned out to be a watershed year when they added keyword arguments and the language kind of started looking like it looks today, and they stopped changing stuff. This is very important because I was pretty scarred by the 2011 experience when there was Ruby 1.8 and 1.9 was very painful, and 2.0 was like lesser painful, but who knows if it would come back. That's back when MySQL ruled the earth. At that time, Ruby and Postgres were not yet married in the United States. Rails was a MySQL program, and then at Heroku, people always ask, why are you supporting Postgres? That's weird. So language stability also helps. I just upgrade these days. It's fine. Another times people ask, are you only doing all these tests because you have static typing? I find that static typing only actually gives you very superficial reliability guarantees, if you can even call it that. They help catch typos, but what you really need is that huge mass. Well, not huge, because it's actually you need the huge-ish mass of tests, so that every time you get an interesting kind of fault in production, the expensive way, you can capture it into the knowledge base of your test suite. With 100% branch coverage, you leak very little information. Anytime you get an interesting error message, interesting result from like, a disk fails and this particular path can get this kind of message from libc saying IO error, you can mock it in without tearing your hair out. So I find that the tests are much better at assimilating information than types. So when I tell people like, well, it's actually more rigorous than types because you can get pretty much everything. Is static typing interesting? I think it is, mostly for typo detection and navigation. So I do think the interest in typing in Ruby is probably well placed rather than maybe changing the language too much. But we can kind of slow roll it. I'm very impressed with, say, Ruby LSP. It seems like it's come a long way. And also when I used Sorbet at the previous project, it was very good at finding typos, but it wasn't really great at finding or accumulating information about bugs. Another thing that we use pretty extensively is the REPL. Here you can see me commenting on a page with an exact stack trace of what the problem was. So it's contemporarily noted. The methodology is very clear. It's easy to share. I find that this is one reason why I would probably never write this kind of program in a non-REPL language, as to say almost certainly every static language. So pretty much any static language is pretty much out, and really you're talking about which dynamic language you're going to use. Because it's just the note-taking abilities of using the interpreter is, I just don't see how you could possibly write an efficient operation without it. Here's a fun example of this. There's this ad hoc report, which you can't even see. Because you can actually, I just pasted this into the terminal to do this crazy report on, it was combining the GitHub API, some secure shell commands, and some of our database models in order to report some stuff. And that's very useful to just hack that out, solve your problem, understand the issue, and move on. But the most important recontextualization or reinterpretation I save for last. And I feel like whenever even when I was invited to give these talks, kind of the undercurrent of anxiety about popularity. So the thing is, for someone who's never been using Rails, I've never been popular. Like my dependencies have always been extremely obscure. And in many ways, Postgres was the odd one out back then, where I said, why are you in Rails MySQL world trying to roll this boulder uphill at Heroku to make it Postgres? And I said, because it's better. Duh. That's why. And so really Ruby and Postgres have swapped places, where Postgres is now kind of in and pretty common currency, and Ruby is like, oh yeah, I've heard of it. And yeah, I guess it's good for some stuff. They kind of swap places. But if anything, I got more strange by getting rid of Sinatra and going to Rada. What is the lesson here? It's only important to be adequately popular, I think. Really only a precious few idiosyncratic people are involved in good libraries. And I think more engineers should maybe have some faith in their ability to assess what is good and what is bad, especially by popping open the release process and source code of the libraries they use. And you'll find some interesting stuff in there, like, for example, the Jeremy Evans methodology. So last thing is, I could really use your help. And by using your help, I mean you could try out Ubicloud and report bugs. That's what I mean by helping. Yes, also you could pay a little bit of money, but really, I want your bug reports. Thank you. I have 2 minutes left. Do you have any questions, comments, stories? So Active Record has been playing a long game of catch up with, not only SQL, because I don't think they necessarily, sometimes they probably look at it, but SQL kind of is part of the category of design data set chaining. And they've been, it was kind of a massive effort, but, they added RL and so forth to kind of make it more powerful. But I think there's even still some stuff you can't express. The gap, I think, maybe has been narrowing somewhat, although I think a lot of people who are aficionados say, well, SQL is faster and more expressive and more straightforward. By the way, really good to use LLMs to help it write the DSL. Good tip. Even I know it, I still use it to avoid consulting the manual. I think the test performance is probably why I would do it. If you're really into going the 100%, which I think, that is where it really can add up. Okay, 60 seconds. All right. Yes, please help us find bugs, rough edges, and we'll understand you a little better when you tell us what's wrong. And also, you might get a kick out of being able to understand the patch that fixes your problem. Because unlike other language communities, you can't just crack it open and be like, oh yeah, that's what they did. Oh wow, that was dumb. Why'd they do it that way originally? All right.